Imagine standing in the middle of one of the greatest cities of Earth, or on Earth. The streets around you are wide and alive with activity. Merchants call out to customers as they arrange ivory carvings, woven clothes, spices, and coral beads across their stalls, right? Blacksmiths strike, glowing iron practice precision. Children race through crowded marketplaces, while elders gather beneath shaded trees, discussing matters that will shape the future of their communities. Ahead of you stands an enormous palace. Its walls stretch farther than you can easily see, right? Wooden pillars are covered with intricate carvings that tell stories of kings, victory ceremonies, and ancestors whose names have been remembered for generations. Soldiers stand watch at the palace gates. Messengers move quickly through the city carrying news from the Oba, the king of Benin, right? Everything around you feels organized, purposeful, confident. Now let me ask you something. When you pictured that city, did you imagine it was in Africa? Because if we're being honest, a lot of us probably didn't, right? For generations, African history has often been introduced through one painful chapter after another, right? And everybody talks about slavery, colonization, right? Segregation, right? These chapters, I mean, they are real. I mean, they're important and they deserve to be remembered. But if that's only the place we begin, we end up believing that black history starts with suffering. It doesn't. I mean, long before European powers divided Africa into colonies, long before maps were redrawn, long before the Atlantic slave trade reshaped millions of lives, African civilizations were already building kingdoms. They were creating governments, developing systems of law, trading across vast regions, building cities, producing art that still amazes experts today. One of those civilizations was the Kingdom of Benin. And I have to be honest, the first time I really learned about Benin, I felt cheated, man, bro. Like, look, not because someone lied to me, but because no one had ever told me the full story. Growing up, I learned about ancient Egypt. I learned about Greece, Rome, the Vikings, medieval Europe. But somehow, one of Africa's most remarkable kingdoms barely received a mention. That made me wonder, like, okay, how many other stories have been sitting quietly in history books, waiting for someone to tell them, right? Today, we're going to tell one of those stories, right? At least I'm going to tell one of those stories. But before we talk about kings, right, we got to look at it, though. Or famous works of art, or the walls that surrounded one of Africa's greatest cities. We have to understand where this kingdom came from, because kingdoms don't appear overnight, right? Nobody wakes up one morning and discovers an empire. Empires are built, right? One family at a time, right? One decision at a time. Centuries before Europeans ever reached this part of West Africa, people were already living in the forest and fertile lands that would eventually become the Kingdom of Benin. Life followed the rhythm of the seasons. Families farmed yams, vegetables, and other crops that sustained their communities. Hunters moved through dense forests with knowledge passed down from fathers to sons and mothers to daughters. Craftsmen shaped wood, iron, and clay into tools used every day. These weren't isolated living without direction. They weren't isolated people at all. They belonged to organized communities connected by shared traditions, customs, and responsibilities. Neighbors depended on one another, right? Elders settled disputes. Knowledge wasn't looked inside books. It lived in people. Stories were passed from one generation to the next. Children learn not only how to survive, but how to belong. That's something I think we've lost appreciation for in the modern world. Today, if we want information, right, we want to reach for our phones, man, all the time. Look, and Benin, knowledge lived in memory. It lived in conversations around evening fires, right? It lived in ceremonies, right? And songs, man, and family traditions. Every generation became responsible for carrying the next generation forward. That's how it was. Over time, these communities became larger, trade expanded, relationships between neighboring settlements, and it grew more complex. As populations increased, so did the need for stronger leadership. Questions had to be answered. Who settles disagreements between villages? Who protects trade routes? Who organizes defense when danger appears? Who speaks for everyone? Little by little, leadership evolved. Not because one person demanded power, but because growing societies need organization if they're going to survive. This wasn't unique to Africa. Every great civilization in history followed a similar path, right? Egypt, China, Mesopotamia, the Maya, the Inca, Rome. They all reached the point where communities became too large to function without structure. Benin was no different. As leadership became more centralized, traditions developed that would eventually shape one of Africa's longest lasting royal dynasties. The people who would later become famous as the Edo people were laying foundations they probably never imagined would last for centuries. And that's one of the most fascinating parts of history. The people building the future rarely know how important their own lives will become. Think about it, right? Think about it. The farmer planting crops wasn't trying to build an empire. The blacksmith making tools wasn't thinking about history books. The mother teaching her children wasn't imagining people would still be talking about her civilization hundreds of years later, right? They were simply living, right? Working, building, trusting that tomorrow would be better than today. That's how civilizations grow, man. Look, not through one extraordinary moment, but through millions of ordinary moments repeated across generations. Ask a black man learning about kingdoms like Benin changes the way you look at history. Because it reminds me that our ancestors weren't just reaching to the world around them. They were shaping it, right? Creating it, improving it, leaving something behind for the next generation, right? That's a legacy worth remembering. And believe me, we've only just scratched the surface. Believe me when I say that. And because the communities we've been talking about are about to become something much greater. A kingdom unlike anything that, right, that's outside we would expect to find, right? A kingdom whose rulers would become known as the Obas. I'm going to tell you about the Obas. A kingdom whose capital will one day leave foreign visitors speechless. A kingdom whose artists would create masterpieces that museums around the world still treasure today. The kingdom of Benin was about to rise, and its story was only beginning. Right? So look, let me just tell you this though. Look, the rise of the Oba, right? Every great civilization reaches a moment where everything changes. For Benin, right? That moment wasn't a war. It wasn't the discovery of gold. And it wasn't the arrival of Europeans. It was leadership. Because a civilization can have rich farmland, skilled craftsmen, growing trade, and hard-working people. But without leadership, man, it's difficult to unite thousands of people behind one vision. The people living in the forests of what is now southern Nigeria understood that, right? And as their communities grew larger, right? New challenges appeared. Villages traded with one another. Families expanded. Land became more valuable. Disagreements became more complicated. Questions couldn't always be answered by a single family or village elder anymore, right? The kingdom needed something greater. It needed someone who can unite people who didn't always know each other. Someone whose authority stretched beyond one village. Someone who can protect trade, maintain peace, and keep different communities working together instead of fighting one another, right? That's where the story of Oba begins. Now, the title Oba, right? Or the name Oba simply means king. But in Benin, the Oba wasn't viewed as just another ruler. The Oba represented the heart of the kingdom. He wasn't simply expected to command an army. He was expected to protect tradition, maintain justice, guide ceremonies, strengthen relationships between communities, and remind the people that the kingdom belonged to all of them. Think about that. Power wasn't only about giving orders. It came with enormous responsibility. If crops failed, people looked to the Oba. If enemies threatened the kingdom, people looked to the Oba. Right? If disputes divided communities, people looked to the Oba. Leadership meant carving the hopes of an entire civilization. According to Benin's oral traditions, the royal dynasty began with Iwaka, right? Who was traditionally remembered as the first Oba of Benin. His rise marked the beginning of the line of rulers that would continue for centuries. What's remarkable was that these traditions have survived through generations of storytelling. Before written records became widespread in the region, history was preserved through memory. Professional storytellers, royal ceremonies, right? Family traditions, each generation became responsible for teaching the next. I'm sorry, it's real hot out here. And that's something I really admire. Because today, we assume history only existed if it's written in a book. But history existed long before books that lived inside people. Every story repeated. Every ceremony performed. Right? Every ancestor remembered. Helped preserve the identity of the kingdom. As Benin became more organized, its government became more sophisticated. The Oba didn't rule alone. It relied on experienced chiefs, advisors, military leaders, religious officials, and respected elders. Each had responsibilities. Each helped the kingdom functioning. That's something many people don't realize. Strong kingdoms aren't built by one extraordinary leader. They're built by capable people working together. One person can inspire a nation, but thousands of people keep it running. Benin understood that leadership was shared across different parts of society. Responsibilities were divided carefully. Decisions often involved consultation. Experience mattered, right? Wisdom mattered. Traditions mattered. As the kingdom expanded, its influence reached farther across the region. Communities joined the kingdom. Trade routes became safer. Markets became busier. Farmers produced more food than ever before. Skilled craftsmen found new customers. This kingdom wasn't growing because it conquered everyone around it. Much of its strength came from organization. People trusted the stability Benin offered, right? And stability creates opportunity. When merchants know roads are safe, trade grows. When farmers believe their harvest will be protected, they plant more crops, right? When families believe tomorrow will be peaceful, communities become stronger. That's exactly what happened in Benin. The forests surrounding the kingdom became highways of commerce, right? Paths connected villages. Villages connected towns. Towns connected the capital. Goods move constantly. Palm oil, yams, fish, ivory, pepper, cloth, right? Things, right? Iron tools, right? Coral. Every trade strengthened the kingdom's economy. But perhaps the greatest investment Benin ever made was in its people. Children learn skills from their parents. All right, okay. Blacksmiths trained apprentices. Wow. All right. Woodcravers spent years mastering techniques. Okay. Bronze casters practiced until every detail became second nature. Okay. Leadership itself was taught across generations. All right. All right. You hear me? All right. Knowledge wasn't something people kept to themselves. It was something they passed forward. You hear me? All right. That may be one of the greatest lessons Benin leaves us today. Listen to me. A civilization survives when knowledge survives. Listen to me. Think about that for a second. Buildings can collapse. Empires can fall. I don't think y'all hear me, man. Look, treasures can disappear, but if people continue teaching one another, the civilization lives on. Are you hearing me? As a black man, right? That's something that really speaks to me. Because our ancestors understood something powerful. Every generation has a responsibility. You better listen to me, man. You better listen to me. Not just to live, but to leave something behind. Whether that's wisdom, character. You better listen to me, bro. Faith, knowledge, or opportunity. Pay attention to me. The goal isn't simply to survive. The goal is to make life better for the people coming after you, bro. Listen to me. Benin embraced that idea. Generations after generation. Century after century. And because of that, the kingdom continued growing until one of the most respected powers in West Africa. But while leadership built the kingdom, there was something else that made Benin famous across the continent. Its capital, bro. Benin City wasn't simply large. It wasn't simply wealthy. People who visited couldn't stop talking about it, right? Or they couldn't stop talking about it. Imagine traveling thousands of miles only to discover one of the most organized cities you have ever seen in your entire life, right? And a place your own people never expected, bro. The streets. We all know about the streets. Some people don't know about the streets. But look, the palace, the enormous earthworks, the markets, you know what I'm saying? The people, everything challenged assumptions. And in the next chapter, man, I'm not even, look. If there was one place that truly powered the greatness of Benin, it was the city itself, right? Hey, look, that's what I'm. It was the city itself. Period. Close your eyes for a second. Look, I'm gonna close my eyes. Close my eyes. Close my eyes for a second. I want you to imagine that it's the late 1400s. You spent months sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. The journey has been long. Storms have tested your ship. The sea has pushed you further than you've ever traveled before. Eventually, you reach the coast of West Africa. You've heard rumors about a kingdom hidden beyond the forest. Some merchants say it's wealthy, right? Okay. Others say it's powerful. All right. A few claim it's unlike anything that they ever seen, right? You don't know what to believe. Every traveler tells stories. Sometimes they're true. Sometimes they're exaggerated. So you begin the journey inland, hour after hour. You move deeper into the forest. The air feels different, right? The trees seem endless. Then, all of a sudden, right, the forest begins to open. And suddenly, you're standing in front of one of the greatest cities you've ever seen. Not because someone imagined it. Not because of a legend, right? Of course not. Because it actually existed. This is Benin City. And almost immediately, you realize everything you thought you knew about Africa was wrong. The first thing you notice is the streets. They're wide, right? They're wider than you expected. People move through them in an organized flow, right? Merchants, farmers, right? Soldiers, children, priests, royal messengers. Everyone seems to know exactly where they're going. There's no confusion? No panic? What? Just life? Huh? Busy? Orderly? Purposeful? Are you serious? That surprised many early visitors, right? Some Europeans who recorded their experiences described streets that were unusually broad and laid out with a sense of order they had not expected to find. Right? Whether they had visited Lisbon, Amsterdam, or other great cities of their time, right? Benin made an impression. And that's very important, right? Because history is full of opinions. But when multiple visitors from different backgrounds describe the same place with admiration, you start paying attention, man. As you continue walking, you notice something else, right? The city feels clean, man. Homes are arranged with attention, right? Compounds are carefully organized. Open spaces separate neighborhoods, right? Nothing feels random. Everything feels planned. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a city that simply grew by accident. Generations of people have spent centuries improving it, right? Every road, every building, every marketplace, every neighborhood. Somebody designed it. Somebody maintained it. Somebody believed future generations deserve something even better than what they inherited. And that's what the civilizations do. They don't just build for today. They build for tomorrow. Eventually, you arrive at the center of the kingdom, the royal palace. Now, calling it a palace almost doesn't do it justice, right? This wasn't one building. It was an enormous complex. Courtyards connected to other courtyards. Residences connected to ceremonial spaces. Meeting halls. Storage areas. Workshops. Places where artists created masterpieces. Places where chiefs advised the Oba. Places where ambassadors from distant lands were welcome. Imagine the activity. Royal guards standing at attention. Officials carrying in messages. Drummers announcing important ceremonies. Musicians filling the air with rhythm. Visitors waiting for audiences with the king. Right? The palace wasn't just where the Oba lived. It was where the kingdom functioned. It was the heart of the Benin. Every important decision passed through these walls, bro. Every celebration, every royal ceremony, every diplomatic meeting. This is where the history happened. And then there were the walls. When people think about massive walls, right? Most immediately picture China. But very few people realize that Benin was surrounded by an extraordinary network of earthworks, right? Moats, walls, defensive barriers built over generations. Some historians estimate that the earthworks surrounding Benin and neighboring communities stretch for thousands of kilometers when considered as a regional system. Think about the amount of work that required, right? No bulldozers, right? No cranes, right? No engines. Just people. Thousands of them, though. Digging. Planning. Measuring. Building. Generations after generation. Parents worked besides children. Communities worked inside neighboring communities. Each generation that is something the next generation would inherit. Hey, look, that's one of the things I admire most about civilization like Benin, right? People weren't only thinking about themselves, right? They were thinking about the people they would never ever meet, right? Future generations. Imagine spending years building walls you may never see completed, simply because you believe your grandchildren deserve protection. That's powerful because it reminds us that greatness isn't built by one generation. It's built by many. And as the city continued growing, its markets became some of the busiest in West Africa. Every morning, the streets came alive, right? Women arranged baskets filled with peppers, right? Yams, right? Plantains, right? Palm oil, fresh vegetables. Hunters arrived carrying game from the forest. Fishermen displayed their catches, right? Iron workers offered farming tools. Leather workers sold sandals and bags. Ivory carvers displayed beautiful sculptures. Weavers unfolded colorful cloth. Merchants from neighboring regions brought goods that couldn't be found inside the kingdom, man. Come on now, you just didn't hear business. You heard life. Laughter, right? Negotiating. Children chasing each other and stuff like that, right? Like the children we know that used to play in the streets. Musicians playing drums. People greeting friends they hadn't seen in weeks, right? This wasn't just commerce. This was community. Every marketplace became a place where information traveled, right? News spread, man. Ideas spread. Relationships grew stronger. That's one thing history sometimes forgets to tell us. Markets weren't only about buying and selling. They were where civilizations connected, right? As a black man, learning about Benin City completely changed my perspective. Because for years, right, I had heard about people describe Africa before colonization as if great cities didn't exist, and as if organized governments didn't exist, as if architecture didn't exist. Then you study Benin. You read the accounts left by people who actually walked the streets. You look at archaeological evidence, right? You examine engineering. And suddenly, that picture becomes to change. You realize something, right? The problem was never that these civilizations didn't exist. The problem was that too few people were telling their stories, right? Benin wasn't trying to prove anything to the world. It simply existed. It thrived. It grew. And inspired. And for centuries, it stood as one of the Africa's greatest achievements. But there was one thing visitors talked about almost as much as the city itself, right? Its artists, right? Because inside the palace, inside workshops, throughout the kingdom, master craftsmen were creating works so extraordinary that centuries later, museums around the world would still be displaying them, right? And then the next, right, look, so it's, can you imagine that? can't, like, just think for a second. Just imagine that, right? So just imagine that. Just imagine it just for a little second though, like, and let you get a little take on it though. Like, is this, this is real though, right? Right. So this really real though, like on everything, like it's really real. Yeah, I'm out here in a good day, man. Just enjoying my time, man. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Just out and about. Old documents, right? Maps, ancient scrolls, maybe photographs. If the story is more recent, right? But imagine living in a world before cameras, right? I'm gonna tell you this: before newspapers, before printing presses, right? How do you preserve your history? How do you make sure your children and your grandchildren know who came before them? The people of Benin found their answer, right? They cast their history into bronze, right? Every king, every victory, every ceremony, right? Every important moment, they turn memory into something you could teach, or could touch. Something that could survive for centuries. And that's exactly why the Benin Bronzes are so important, right? They're not simply decorations, they're history. Imagine walking into the royal palace and the sunlight pours through the open courtyards, right? And as your eyes adjust, you begin noticing bronze plaques, right? Lining the walls, one after another, each one different, each one telling a story. Some showing Obas sitting proudly on his throne. Others show warriors carrying spears and shields. Some capture royal ceremonies, right? Others show musicians, hunters, priests, right? Royal attendants, even foreign visitors. Every plaque is like opening another page in history book, right? Except this history book isn't made of paper. It's made of bronze. And somehow, hundreds of years later, these pages are still being read. That's incredible because long before photography, the artists of Benin understood something. If your people are going to be remembered, you have to preserve your story. The craftsmen who created these masterpieces weren't ordinary. They belong to highly respected guilds, right? These guilds were made up of families who spent generations perfecting their craft. Knowledge wasn't written in instruction manuals. It was passed from master to apprentice, father to son, teacher to student. Every mistake became a lesson. Every success became part of the next generation's education. Think about the patience that required. Imagine spending years, right? Not weeks, not months, years. Learning how to shape a bronze, right? Shake bronze. Years learning how to capture someone's expression. Years learning how to tell an entire story without writing a single word, right? That level of dedication deserves respect, don't it? Right? One of the techniques that they mastered is known today as lost wax casting. Even now, it's an incredible process. First, the artist carefully sculpted the entire figure out of wax. Every detail mattered, right? The folds in a robe, the texture of a necklace, the expressions on a face, the pattern of a crown. Nothing could be rushed. Once the wax sculpture was complete, it was covered with layers of clay. The clay hardened. Then the mold was heated. As the temperature rose, the wax melted away, leaving an empty space inside. Molten bronze was poured into that space. When the metal cooled, the clay mold was carefully broken apart. Right inside, right, a finished sculpture emerged. Right, but here's what makes it even more remarkable. Right, the mold could only be used once. One mistake, one crack, one error, and the artist had to begin all over again. Right, there was no copy. No second attempt using the same mold. Every piece was unique. Every piece required extraordinary skill. That's one reason historians and art experts continue to admire the Benin Bronzes today. They're not only beautiful, they're technically extraordinary, bro. As a black man, the first time I saw one of these bronzes up close, it changed something inside of me, bro. Because for so many years, I heard people describe Africa before colonization as if sophisticated art didn't exist, as if advanced craftsmanship belonged somewhere else. Then you stand in front of one of those sculptures. You notice the detail, the balance, the precision, the confidence of the artist, and suddenly, right, those old stereotypes began falling apart. You realize something. The problem was never the evidence. The evidence has been here all along. The problem was that too many people were never shown it, right? And that's why these bronzes matter, right? They're proof. Proof that generations of artists dedicated their lives to excellence. Proof that Benin valued creativity. Proof that history can survive in many different forms. Some civilizations wrote on paper. Some carved into stone, right? Benin poured its history into bronze. And because of that, right, its story survived. For centuries, though, the Obas continued commissioning these works, right? Each ruler added another chapter, right? Another ceremony, another memory, another reminder that the kingdom was still growing. The palace became more than the home of the king. It became a living museum, right? A place where every visitor could see the story of Benin unfolding around them. Imagine being a young child walking through those halls. Every bronze teaching you something about your ancestors. Every carving reminding you of who you were, right? Every sculpture saying, this is where you come from, right? That's powerful, though. That's real deep. That's real powerful. Because identity matters, though, in a real way. And people know where they come from, right? And often have a stronger sense of where they're going. The Kingdom of Benin understood that, right? Its artists weren't simply creating beauty. They were preserving identity, right? They were protecting memory. They were making sure that centuries later, people like us would still know their names. But with Benin's artists were creating masterpieces, right? The world beyond the kingdom was changing. Ships were arriving farther away. Trade was expanding. And new opportunities appeared. So did new dangers, right? And at first, right, those relationships seemed promising. Right? Merchants came seeking trade. Right? Diplomats came seeking friendship. Right? The Oba welcomed visitors under his own terms. But history has taught us something, right? Sometimes the greatest challenges don't arrive with armies. Right? Sometimes they arrive with a handshake. And before long, the Kingdom of Benin would face a future no one inside its walls could fully predict. Hey, look. Think about that for a second, though, man. Look, they couldn't predict what was happening, like what was headed for the future. So look, those meetings led to friendship, right? So sometimes they led to opportunity, right? And sometimes they changed history forever. So for the Kingdom of Benin, that moment arrived near the end of the 15th century. Imagine standing along the coastline of West Africa, right? For generations, the ocean had been part of life. Fishermen sailed its waters. Communities traded with neighboring regions, right? The sea wasn't unfamiliar at all, right? But one day, all right, something appeared on the horizon that few people had ever seen before, right? Massive wooden ships, right? Their sails caught the wind like enormous white wings, right? Right? And as they drew closer, the people on shore realized these weren't traders from nearby kingdoms. These were strangers. They spoke different languages, wore different clothing, and came from lands thousands of miles away. They were Portuguese explorers. And the Portuguese were among the first Europeans that established lasting contact with the Kingdom of Benin. At first, neither side fully understood the other, right? That's understandable. But imagine trying to communicate without sharing a common language. And doesn't that happen now these days, right? Different customs, different beliefs, different ideas about government, right? Different ideas about the world itself, right? Yet, despite those differences, trade began, and trade has a remarkable way of bringing people together. The Portuguese saw a kingdom that was organized, powerful, right? Stable, right? They found skilled craftsmen producing beautiful ivory carvings, right? They saw finely woven cloth, right? Pepper, coral, metalwork. A royal court with established traditions. This wasn't what many of them expected. Meanwhile, the people of Benin saw opportunities too. Foreign merchants brought goods they had never seen before, right? New materials, new technologies, new ideas, right? The Obas understood something that great leaders throughout history have always understood, right? You don't become stronger by fearing every outsider, but you also don't surrender your independence, right? Trade was welcome. Control was not. And that's an important distinction, right? Because sometimes people imagine that once Europeans reached Africa, they immediately controlled everything. That simply wasn't the case, right? Allegedly, right? For centuries, the Kingdom of Benin remained independent. European merchants didn't rule the kingdom, and they didn't appoint its leaders. They didn't write its laws. If they wanted to trade, they did so under the authority of the Obas. Think about what that tells us, right? Benin wasn't a kingdom waiting to be discovered. It was already negotiating with foreign powers from a position of strength. That's a very different picture from the one many of us grew up hearing, right? As trade expanded, Benin's reputation spread across Europe. Travelers returned home describing a city unlike anything they expected, right? They spoke about broad streets, an impressive place, master artists, a disciplined government. Those stories fascinated people who had never set foot in Africa. Some couldn't believe them, right? Others wanted to see the kingdom for themselves. So every new visitor carried another piece of Benin's reputation back across the Atlantic. But history has always taught us something, right? Trade changes people, right? Sometimes for the better, and sometimes in ways no one expects. right? As European nations became wealthier, right, competition increased. Portugal wasn't the only country sailing across the Atlantic anymore. The Dutch arrived. Later, the British, French merchants, Spanish traders, more ships, more competition, more pressure. And wherever powerful nations compete, politics usually follows. What began as commerce slowly became something much larger across the continent. European governments weren't simply looking for trading partners anymore. They wanted influence, access to resources, control over important trade routes, right? The world around Benin was changing. Slowly at first, then faster with every passing generation. Benin adapted the way great civilizations often do. Right? The Obas negotiated, protected their kingdom, right? Managed relationships with foreign merchants, right? Balanced opportunity with caution, though, and all access, but maintaining that balance became more difficult as the centuries passed, right? Right? The Atlantic world was changing. Demand for goods increased. Competitions between Europe powers intensified. Man, I can go on. And Africa kingdoms found themselves navigating challenges unlike anything previous generations have faced. History rarely gives leaders easy choices, right? The rulers of Benin weren't making decisions with the benefit of hindsight. They didn't know what the next 100 years would bring. They only knew the world around them was changing. And they were trying to protect their people. That's something I think we should remember whenever we study history. It's easy for us to judge decisions, made hundreds of years ago. We already know how the story ends, right? They didn't. They weren't living it. As a black man, learning this part of Benin's history reminds me that civilizations are constantly adapting. No society stays frozen in time. Every generation faces new challenges, right? New opportunities, new risks. The question isn't whether change will come. It always does. The question is, how do you respond when it arrives? For Benin, that answer would soon be tested, because by the 19th century, Europe was no longer satisfied with trade alone. Powerful governments wanted something much greater. They wanted territory, control, empire. And one of Africa's greatest kingdoms was about to stand in the path of that ambition. Everything Benin has spent centuries building, its government, its traditions, its art, its identity, will soon face the greatest challenge in its history. And what happened next, would change the kingdom forever. All right. So just think about that for a second, though, right? I hope you've been with me with the beginning of this story, though. I appreciate you, right? Right? I just want you to know something important, right? The Kingdom of Benin wasn't a forgotten corner of history, right? It wasn't an isolated village in a forest, right? It was one of the most organized and respected kingdoms in West Africa. Its rulers governed for centuries, right? Its capital impressed foreign visitors, right? Its artists created masterpieces that still amaze the world, right? Its people built a civilization that believed in planning for generations they would never meet. But history has a way of reminding us that no civilization exists in isolation forever. But by the late 1800s, the world had changed, right? Across Europe. Industrial factories were producing goods at a pace never seen before. powerful governments were searching for new markets, new resources, and new territories, right? This period became known as the Scramble for Africa. Within just a few decades, European powers claimed control over vast areas of the African continent. Borders were drawn, right? Treaties were signed, sometimes without consulting the people already living there, right? For kingdoms like Benin, right, the pressure was becoming like impossible to ignore, right? I get it, right? For centuries, right? I gotta sneeze, hold on. The Obas had welcome trade while protecting the kingdom's independence, but now the British government wanted more than trade, right? It wanted greater political influence and broader commercial access. At the same time, the Obas was trying to protect Benin's traditions and authority. The relationship grew more intense with each passing year, right? Then, all of a sudden, in January of 1897, a turning point arrived. A British delegation set out for Benin City, right? Historical accounts indicate that Benin officials had warned that an important religious festival was taking place and requested that the visit be postponed. Right? The delegation continued anyway. But before reaching the city, it was attacked. Right? Several members of the expedition were killed. The event shocked Britain. News spread quickly. The British government responded by organizing what became known as the colonization expedition. Within weeks, hundreds of British troops supported by naval forces and modern weapons were sent toward Benin. Imagine what that must have felt like for the people of Benin. For generations, this kingdom had defended itself. It had survived political changes, regional conflicts, economic shifts. Now, an army unlike anything they had faced before what was approaching, right? The warriors of Benin fought to defend their homeland. They knew the forests. They knew the roads. They knew every path leading toward the city. But courage alone could not overcome the difference in military technology. British forces carried repeated rifles, right? Machine guns and artillery. Weapons that gave them a devastating advantage, right? Eventually, the British centered Benin City. What happened next is one of the most painful chapters. I call it chapters, though, in history, right? Because the buildings were set on fire. I mean, this is put in different sections, right? Sections of the royal palace were destroyed. Homes were damaged. Generations of history disappeared in smoke. Then came the looting. Soldiers removed thousands of objects from the palace, right? Bronze plaques, royal heads, ivory carvings, ceremonial bells, leopard figures, right? Personal items belonging to generations of Obas. These weren't random decorations. They were the memory of a civilization. Imagine walking into a family's home, right? Taking every photograph, every journal, every heirloom, every piece of history that connected them to their ancestors. Now imagine that happening to an entire kingdom, right? That's why the Benin Bronzes matter so much today, right? They weren't created for museums. They were created for Benin. Many of those objects were later sold, right? Others entered museums throughout Britain, Germany, France, and other countries, right? Over time. You know what I'm saying? People around the world came to admire their beauty. Art historians praised their craftsmanship. Museums displayed them as masterpieces. But another question slowly became impossible to ignore, right? How did they get there? That question has led to conversations that continue even today. But over the past several years, some museums and universities have returned to Benin Bronzes to Nigeria, right? Others have announced plans to do so. Some institutions continue to debate ownership, preservation, and how these objects should be cared for in the future. Reasonable people have different views on how these questions should be resolved. But one thing is almost universally recognized. The Benin Bronzes are among the greatest artistic achievements in human history. And they tell a story of a civilization that deserves to be remembered. As a black man standing in front of one of these bronzes feels different, right?